KV-1 Iron Souls is a 2018 Russian film that tells the story of a KV-1 tank crew at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, actually, at the beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942. This tank, which is the protagonist of this film, the KV-1 tank, is the first in the KV tank series. And KV is named in honor of the then People's Commissar of Defense of the Soviet Union, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov. They were heavy tanks with armor far superior to what the Germans were used to facing, and therefore it became a source of great terror for the German armored vanguards. Once they began the invasion of the country in June 1941. Very well, but we also have a movie that is based on a true story, although, well, loosely based on a true story. Why? Because the protagonist of this movie, Semyon Konovalov, a captain in the movie, but actually a lieutenant in real life, was indeed a tank commander. In fact, he was the one who carried out a very remarkable action during the Second Battle of Rostov in July 1942 on July 13th. Semyon Konovalov, with his KV-1 tank, which had gone through several maintenance issues, several operational problems in the days and hours before, he really accomplished a very unique feat all by himself, which was the destruction of 16 German tanks from 2 different panzer divisions plus several reconnaissance vehicles. But, as I already mentioned, this movie here strays quite a bit from the original story of Semyon Konovalov, and it adds a lot of elements that personally I found quite unnecessary and demeaning for the story of this hero of the Soviet Union, starting with what I liked about this movie. I have to be very honest with you. Here, what I really appreciated most about this production was the fact that it's only 90 minutes long, so it doesn't drag on too much. It doesn't keep you watching for too long. Something that really doesn't add anything, because to like this movie, man, to like KV-1, you have to have some level of appreciation for the KV-1 tank, which honestly is a rare vehicle. It's very rare to see it on screen. So it's a vehicle that you won't find in other movies, and you become aware of its historical importance. Therefore, it is indeed interesting to see a KV-1 maneuvering on screen. And even though the scenes in this movie, the cinematography doesn't highlight the tank as much as other productions have highlighted their protagonists, okay? So it's really a great pity that there aren't many other merits. For example, Russian military history films are always very sharp when it comes to uniforms. They get the uniforms quite right. And here too, the uniforms are accurate to the exact period being portrayed. However, man, everything else suffers from a lack of care that really falls short of the standard of Russian cinema, as we know it now from the late 2010s onwards, right? So, what didn't I like about this movie? Why didn't I like it? I don't think you can generalize Russian movies as being bad. No. There are great Russian movies out there. I've already mentioned some of them here. The last one I watched, for example, was something very similar to this movie here. It's T-34. Okay, the T-34 movie is a good movie, man. It's a movie where you sit on the couch, eat your popcorn, or have your drink, relax, and you can enjoy those almost 2 hours. Sitting on the couch, you have fun and leave satisfied with the experience. Why? Because T-34 has good production. It pays close attention to historical detail, and it knows very well what it wants to be. In my review of T-34, I said, this movie is a goofy movie that knows it's goofy, acts goofy, and delivers first-rate goofiness. But KV-1 doesn't know what it wants to be, man. Why? It wants to be a serious movie. It presents itself as a serious movie. But the involuntary silliness in the plot in the characters' actions, in the acting, and in the execution of the combat scenes takes away the seriousness of the movie. From the moment the movie started until the moment it ended, and it ended quite abruptly. By the way, it has a completely unexpected ending. I had the clear feeling, man, that I was numb, that I couldn't feel anything that was actually being shown on the screen, represented on the screen. For me, there was no feeling of haste, no feeling of drama, no sense of urgency. There was no emotion at all. Not even in the combat scenes, and not even in the countless, much more numerous scenes of pointless conversation. In that camp that the whole movie seems to revolve around, right? That camp of the Soviet tankers. Well, all of that, man, for me, centers on the choice of the actor who played Semyon Konovalov in this movie. And in the way the script portrays this actor, right? Because every choice this guy makes in this movie is terrible. The guy has no personal charisma. The actor doesn't have it. His portrayal doesn't have it. He's rude to his subordinates, to his crew. He stars in some scenes that make you wonder, wait a minute, there must be some kind of payoff at the end, right? Like a redemption for the character. But as the movie gets closer to the end, he doesn't change at all. In his personality, he doesn't change at all in the way he acts. And you realize that, man, he essentially left behind a crew that seemed to be inexperienced to certain death, right? At the beginning of the movie, he refuses to rescue a T-34 because he wanted to teach the crew of that T-34 a lesson. And besides that, besides acting all tough and cool, he, moments later, after ignoring information that there was still a hidden Panzer IV that hadn't been located, he ignores the information. So, he condemns his crew to death, taking a point-blank shot from a Panzer IV. And this happens in the first 5 minutes of the movie, and you think the guy is going to change, right? He's going to go through some kind of psychological or philosophical change that will make him a better human being. No, he spends the whole movie being the same person he was in the first frame of the film, right? The rest of the cast in this movie is also unremarkable. The rest of the cast doesn't do anything to salvage what's already bad about the main character. We have, for example, the crew, the second crew, the new crew of Konovalov, which is made up of guys. You can clearly see that the script made them the comic relief. For example, the loader, the gunner comes in boasting, right? Presenting himself as the best gunner with a kind of weird dialogue with the chubby loader, right? Saying that now your life will be defined as before and after the moment you met me. That was really strange. And we have to highlight the role here, right? I talked about lack of expression in this movie, but we have to highlight the role, man, of that actress, Olga Pagolina, who plays that engineer, a female character who was inserted into the plot. To be a kind of focal point of a love triangle like Pearl Harbor, with Kate Beckinsale back in 2001. So it seems to me that the writers wanted to insert this element into a story about Soviet tankers in World War II because, man, that woman, her acting makes no sense at all. She doesn't project any emotion at any point in the movie. She's just a trophy. Really just a plastic doll. All her facial acting throughout the movie is blasé. There's no emotion. Even on the movie cover, right? On the movie poster, you can see that her gaze is lost. Man, I've seen a lot of bad acting, but this girl's performance in this movie is really up there among the worst. And a fight over her results in, without a doubt, the weirdest scene in this movie, which is when Konovalov fights with a major who wanted to get close, romantically to the woman who was his ex-wife. She was his ex-wife. You only find out later. And suddenly the colonel of the armored regiment shows up and goes to break up the two. And the colonel, incredibly, he looks a lot like the marshal of the Soviet Union, Grigory Kulik, who was undoubtedly the worst of the Soviet Union's marshals in terms of incompetence, right? But the colonel, man, just separates the two. It's unbelievable. There's no problem believing that. So far as I've seen, he separates the two and says, settle this in the soccer match, and then the guy throws a ball. And suddenly, the armored regiment's camp turns into a soccer field. It turns into some kind of soccer field, I don't know. And the guys start playing soccer there. To be able to resolve the tension caused by the fight over the engineer. Really weird. But speaking of tanks, right? This movie is a movie about armored vehicles, so we have to do an analysis of the armored vehicles here. In this movie, besides the acting, but man, the first thing I noticed right at the beginning of this movie was how oddly the tanks were portrayed. That even though they have the original working KV-1, it's great to see. We still have a scene from 1941, okay, because Konovalov, he gets wounded in September 1941, August, or September 1941. And in the movie, he gets wounded. His crew is wiped out by a long-barreled Panzer IV Wright, a Panzer IV F2, something that would only actually reach the front lines in the Soviet Union a year later. The first ones, right, would arrive a year later in the Soviet Union. And most importantly, this Panzer IV uses Scherzen, right? It uses skirts to cover both the sides of its chassis and the turret as well. But Scherzen only started being used on Panzer IV-S in 43. Right, actually long after the movie ends. And another addition, which I found even more nonsensical, because the representation of the Panzer IV, although historically inaccurate, is technically understandable and acceptable. Why? Because those Panzer IV-S there are actually disguised T-55S, they're Panzer IV replicas made on the T-55 platform. So those skirts are used to camouflage the side of the tank, so you can't tell that the suspension configuration there is actually characteristic of the T-55. All right, there aren't many original Panzer IVs running around out there to be used in movies, right? That's understandable. But right after that, the production shows in April 1942, which is when the rest of the movie takes place, a T-34-85. And it's a pretty extensive use of the T-34-85, which would only reach the front lines at the beginning of 1944. So, considering the number of T-34-76s that Russia has today, and that the movie even shows some of them, I really thought it was a careless mistake, an inexplicable error, to use the T-34-85, especially because right at the beginning of the movie, the first thing you see in the opening credits is that the film was supported by the Russian Society of Military History. So that really strikes me as very odd, Finally, we see a Willys, a Willys MB right there in the middle of the camp. And even though we know that the Soviet Union really did receive a lot of these MBs, and also Ford GPWs, about 50,000 of them throughout the war, through the Lend-Lease program at that time, there still wasn't that standardization with the 9-slot grille, which was actually created by Ford and would only come around later in 1942. So that's a significant pre-production model. That vehicle there is a few months off in the real timeline. That's okay. It's just a few months and the vehicle isn't even that important to the plot, But we have, man, a huge difference there, and it's illogical. And it seems that the film's technical team completely ignored the advice of the Russian Society of Military History. Is it in that village scene? The first attack that the KV-1 crew makes, right? With a tank that's kind of semi-functional, it breaks down in the middle of the action. So they reconnoiter this village, and then Konovalov tells the driver, to reverse up a hill, right? A small mound that's there. So he actually exposes the whole tank and the fragile area of the engine in the back, right, to the fire from German tanks. Meanwhile, he destroys 3 German tanks in a row there. This scene is based on, or at least inspired by, a real action by Semyon Konovalov, but in which he actually used the terrain in the opposite way. He hid most of the tank behind a rise in the ground, leaving only the turret cover exposed. And there he managed to destroy several German tanks from a concealed position. But in the movie, he does exactly the opposite. He exposes the entire tank much more than it would normally be exposed. And while he hits every shot, and every shot causes explosions in the German tanks simply don't hit anything. Even with the tanks stopped because the engine was off in that scene, and with all the vital areas on the top part of the tank exposed, I found that very, very unrealistic, you know? And then we also have that scene where the KV-1 crew fights as infantry, which is an order that I honestly can't conceive of, you know. If the crew is the key part of armored combat, the one that takes the longest to train, including an experienced crew, which is more valuable than a rookie crew, how can you risk them as infantry? Considering that you can simply replace the tank faster because several tanks are produced per day, but a crew takes months to be replaced. And then the first guy from the crew who dies is exactly the most valuable one, which is the chief mechanic, the guy who knew everything about KV-1 mechanics. He's the first to die in this ridiculous attack using tank crews as infantry, right? And then we have the tank commander throwing hand grenades, right? Just like the potato masher style, that potato masher grenade. He throws a grenade at the side of a Panzer IV, and the Panzer IV explodes from a hand grenade. It's very strange, to say the least, right? In the end, the one who's going to save the day is that engineer who goes after this KV-1 tank right in the middle of the front line. She's going to fix the tank by herself. She's going to get the tank working again all by herself. And once Konovalov and his crew get back to the KV-1, do you know what the woman does, man? Do you know what the engineer does? She decides to take a nap on the floor of the tank. They don't. Look at that. Let me explain. They weren't inside an ultra-noisy tank heading to the rear. They were heading to the front line. And the woman decides to take a nap on the floor of the tank. And at one point, she wakes up and says to Konovalov, "If you need me again, wake me up, okay?" And she goes back to her nap. Honestly, I didn't understand. Was that supposed to be funny? Was that scene meant to be serious? Was I supposed to take it seriously? I couldn't tell. Honestly, I couldn't tell. And I'd like to know what you, who have already watched this movie, think about this scene too, because to me, it's pretty unbelievable. Just like the ending of the movie is also pretty unbelievable, which is also based on a story, a piece of Konovalov's story, where he actually captures a Panzer IV and returns to the Russian lines after a while with a Panzer IV. But the way the movie shows it, nobody heard the sound of a tank engine, even when the tank is 20 meters away. It didn't make any sense to me. And so, in my opinion, after watching for 90 minutes this ridiculous piece of Russian historical World War II cinematography about tanks, it's a subject I like so much, and I've seen so many good movies about it from the same country. KV-1, Iron Souls. It deserves a small round of applause. Mercy from a cannon. But tell me, have you watched KV-1, Iron Souls? What did you think? Do you disagree with me? Leave a comment down below. I want to know what you think. If you like this video, then share it with your friends. Also, give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. Because that's it for now. Thanks again for watching, and here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra.